house of high fashion, a dazzling whirl of elegance, of exotic, extravagant beauties. An adventurous journey into the devastating allure of the most sophisticated women and their intimate secrets.
Welcome to episode 38 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are returning to the world of the 1940s horror noir and the Italian giallo, with two highly influential films that would shape many of the tropes that we now see as standard. First up, we have The Spiral Staircase from 1946, directed by Robert Siodmak and starring Dorothy Maguire, Ethel Barrymore, George Brent and Kent Smith. And then we follow this with Six Women for the Killer, also known as Blood and Black Lace, from 1964 and director Mario Bava. This stars Cameron Mitchell, Eva Bartok, Ariana Gorini and Thomas Reiner. Along the way, we'll be discussing the influence of both films on subsequent movie making, the careers of directors Robert Siodmak and Mario Bava, Welsh author Ethel White, and much, much more. But, as always though, before we do any of that, I'd just like to mention the key sources and references that I've used for this week's episode, all of which will be listed and linked in the show notes. So, when talking about Robert Siodmak and The Spiral Staircase, I have referenced the books The File on Robert Siodmak by Joseph Greco and American Gothic, 6 Decades of Classic Horror Cinema by Jonathan Rigby. I've also referred to articles on the websites metrograph.com, offscreen.com, theguardian.com, dasmagazine.de and sensesofcinema.com. I've also referred to Robert Siodmak's biography on the site deutschebiography.de and the obituary for writer Ethel White from the New York Times and the website Abergavenny Local History Society.org.uk. And when discussing Mario Bava and Blood and Black Lace, I have referred to the books The Haunted World of Mario Bava and So Deadly, So Perverse, both written by Troy Howarth, and the book Blood and Black Lace by Roberto Curti, published by Liverpool University Press as part of their Devil's Advocate series. I've also referenced special features and interviews on the Blu-ray release of the film from Arrow Video and an article on the website bfi.co.uk. And for both films, I've also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the movies, directors, cast and crew. Released in 1946, The Spiral Staircase is, if not the first, then certainly one of the earliest mainstream movies to use the subjective camera as the point of view of a killer. And this is a technique that, of course, masks the identity of the murderer, but it also places the audience in the role of deranged voyeur. Dario Argento, who used the subjective viewpoint in many of his early thrillers, has gone on record stating that the film was a significant influence and saying that it was, quote, one of the first times I'd seen that way of looking at and pursuing people, end quote. And of course, it's a trope that has gone on to pretty much define the slasher subgenre, appearing in an endless parade of horror movies, including Black Christmas in 1974, Halloween in 1978, and Friday the 13th in 1980, to name just a handful. But even before these, as early as 1960, Michael Powell used the subjective camera, albeit to a far more disturbing purpose, in his psychological horror Peeping Tom, a much maligned exercise in voyeurism that we'll be discussing in a few weeks' time. The film was also a significant influence on many Italian giallo movies, which is, of course, why this week I have paired it with Blood and Black Lace, one of the foundational films of the subgenre. The Spiral Staircase was directed by Robert Siodmak, a German Jewish émigré who fled his homeland following the rise of the Nazis, first to France and then to the US, where he established a career as a successful director of film noir, though he also worked across a number of other film genres. He was born in 1900, although there are conflicting accounts regarding his place of birth. When he fled to France in the late 1930s, he claimed that his birthplace was Memphis, Tennessee, and that he had been born while his mother and father were holidaying in the US. But this seems more than likely to have been a story generated to help in acquiring a visa rather than being a matter of historical fact. The more convincing version is that he was born in Dresden, Germany in 1900. He was one of 3 children, including his younger brother Kurt, who would later become famous for his work writing classic horror movies, including 1941's The Wolfman and its 1943 sequel, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and The Beast with 5 Fingers in 1946. After completing secondary school in Dresden, where he took acting lessons and performed minor stage roles, Robert studied German language and literature at Marburg University, but it's rather unclear whether he actually graduated. What we do know, though, is that from 1921 he worked as an accountant, and in 1924 he and a journalist called F.W. Kobner established Das Magazin. This was a pocket-sized publication based on American examples, and it introduced the term magazine to Germany for the very first time. Covering film, dance, fashion, photography, and literature, it featured stories by his younger brother Kurt and other well-known authors, and also examples of work from photographers of the Weimar Republic. The first issue sold out immediately and had to be reprinted right away, and with a circulation of over 200,000 copies, it became the most successful monthly illustrated magazine of its time, and this even led to a dedicated cigarette brand being created. The magazine still exists to this day, lasting through both World War II and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, when it became one of the few publications to survive in the newly unified Germany. 2 years later, in 1926, he was hired by his cousin, a film producer called Simon Benzahl, where he translated intertitles for American silent films and began assembling original features composed of stock footage. But 2 years after that, he managed to convince Seymour to finance his first feature, a movie called People on a Sunday, which followed a group of Berlin residents on a summer's day. Hailed as a work of genius and seen as a pivotal film in the development of German cinema, it also featured the talents of several people who would go on to make their names in Hollywood. The story was written by his brother Kurt and was adapted into a screenplay by Billy Wilder, who would go on to direct films including Sunset Boulevard and Some Like It Hot. It was directed by Robert Siodmak and also Edgar G. Ulmer, who would later direct Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff in the expressionist masterpiece The Black Cat in 1934. Siodmak would direct 15 more films in Germany, but then, following the rise of Hitler, he moved to Paris in 1933, and this was a decision that was probably hastened by a rather troubling incident. Robert's 1933 movie, The Burning Secret, came under direct criticism from Joseph Goebbels, the chief propagandist of the Nazi Party. Goebbels was personally affronted by the film's depiction of adultery and wrote an article calling the director, quote, a corrupter of the German family, end quote. So it's little wonder that Robert and Kurt left for Paris shortly afterwards. Arriving in France, he continued his directing career and worked across a number of genres, including drama, musicals, and comedies. But after Hitler invaded Poland, both brothers decided to leave Europe altogether, arriving in California in 1939, where Robert established himself as a master of thrillers and, of course, film noir. Although he had been successful and acclaimed in both Germany and France, in the US he began working on B-movies, with his first film, West Point Widow, released in 1941. This was followed by the spy thriller Secrets of G32 and the comedies The Night Before the Divorce and My Heart Belongs to Daddy, all of which were released in 1942. A year later, he directed a drama called Someone to Remember, and then signed a contract with Universal, beginning his tenure there with Son of Dracula, from a screenplay co-written by his brother Kurt and Eric Taylor. Following Dracula's Daughter in 1936, Son of Dracula was the third in Universal's series and starred Lon Chaney Jr. as the anagrammatically named Count Alucard. It's not the best in the Dracula series. In fact, in my opinion, pretty much anything after Dracula's Daughter can be considered a disappointment, but it was very successful. Ticket sales were 23% above the average box office for the period, and that made it the studio's best-performing horror or science fiction movie of the time. He followed this with his first film noir, 1944's Phantom Lady, and this was based on a novel by Cornell Woolrich, who we discussed very briefly back in episode 2. A thriller about a secretary who tries to prove that her boss didn't commit a murder. It was produced by Joan Harrison, a former screenwriter for Alfred Hitchcock and also Universal's first female executive. Sadly, it was not really a critical success, with many reviewers comparing it unfavourably to Harrison's former employer. But critic Pauline Kael did admit that, quote, "The mood and pacing lift this low-budget thriller out of its class," end quote, though she also went on to say that the ideas, dialogue, and the ending that the studio insisted on did prevent it from becoming a first-rate B-movie. It has, however, had a critical reappraisal in recent years, and many people comment favourably on its intense visual style and use of shadows, as well as a standout performance from actress Ella Raines in the lead role. After this, Robert directed 1944's Cobra Woman, which was apparently an incredibly camp South Seas adventure film. And then he returned to film noir with Christmas Holiday, also released in 1944 and starring Deanna Durbin and Gene Kelly. Despite its seasonal title and the films more usually associated with the two leads, this is an incredibly dark story. A retrospective review, written by writer Pete Bradshaw of The Guardian, said that, quote, "It even beats Die Hard as the least Christmassy Christmas film of all time, but it's my favourite seasonal movie," end quote. In her book The Star Machine, writer Janine Bassinger said that audiences positively reeled out of the cinemas, alienated by its weird, obsessive story of murder and its unwholesomely close mother-son relationship, with Gene Kelly playing a creepy killer. Whether reeling or not, audiences certainly spent no money. The movie made more than $2 million in its opening month and was Universal's most successful film of that year. Two more noirs followed: The Suspect, starring Charles Laughton, again in 1944, and Uncle Harry in 1945. The Suspect, which once again co-starred Ella Raines from Phantom Lady, was a critical and financial success. It was even screened at the White House after a dinner celebrating the wedding anniversary of Franklin D. Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor. But as it's about a man who may or may not have murdered his wife, I'm not entirely sure it was really matched to the occasion. Uncle Harry, which is also known as The Strange Affair of Uncle Harry, once again starred Ella Raines, this time opposite George Sanders and Geraldine Fitzgerald. It wasn't particularly loved by the critics, who called it drab and lifeless, but the writer James Agee praised producer Joan Harrison and Siodmak for creating what he called a superior movie, though he also did add that, quote, "Nobody is to be thanked for the asinine ending," end quote. All of which brings us properly onto our first film of the week, which is The Spiral Staircase. This, of course, is directed by Robert Siodmak and stars Dorothy Maguire, Ethel Barrymore, George Brent, and Kent Smith, and it was based on a novel called Some Must Watch, written by Ethel Lena White. Ethel Lena White is not a name many people remember these days, but in the 1930s she was called the new Edgar Allan Poe and published more than 100 stories and 17 novels. 3 of these were adapted into films, including, of course, The Spiral Staircase, but also, more importantly, Alfred Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes. She was born in 1876 in Abergavenny in Wales and was one of 3 daughters of a carpenter and labourer called William White and his wife Charlotte. Not much is known about her childhood, apart from some details she recounted in a letter to her publishers, where she described her childhood as a happy one. She also wrote that she was surrounded by, quote, Welsh nursemaids, whose lurid stories were probably excellent training for a future thriller writer, end quote. Possibly inspired by these very Welsh nursemaids, she began writing from a very young age and had poems and stories published in a children's magazine by the time she was a teenager. In 1906, she earned her first wage as a professional writer when she was paid £10 by a publication called the Royal Magazine for one of her short stories, and this would be worth about £1,500 today. The story was called An Advertisement Baby and was about a woman who poses as a destitute mother seeking donations, only to be outwitted by a nurse who uncovers the truth and discovers that the baby she is purporting to be her own actually belongs to somebody else. After her mother died in 1917, she moved to London, where she first worked as a clerk for the Ministry of Pensions. But saying that she couldn't stand office life because of the lack of fresh air, she quit this job in 1919 and devoted herself fully to writing fiction. In the same letter to her publisher, she describes her method of working. Quote, I begin about 12 with writing materials. I write a few lines, then get a glass of water, another line or 2, smoke a cigarette, write another line, play with the kitten, and then break for a cup of tea. But somehow a book does get written. I write such an incoherent script that I have to type it out roughly in order to realise what it's all about, and then I play with the typed version quite a lot before the final typing. All of this takes quite a lot of time. End quote. Her first books were romance novels, with a writing style that has since been compared to Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, and also Virginia Woolf. But when romantic fiction fell out of favour, she switched to writing thrillers and suspense novels. These were inspired by her love of cinema, something that she called a perfect mental release, and saying that she used to go before it became fashionable. She also said, quote, People sneered at my base tastes, but I used to love the unfamiliar American backgrounds. End quote. She spent the majority of her adult life fascinated with the formation of fictional plots and the construction of puzzle narratives, establishing a multitude of works which are sadly not quite so well remembered today. Her thrillers included the book Fear Stokes the Village, which was published in 1932, and a year later, in 1933, she published Some Must Watch, which forms the basis of The Spiral Staircase. In 1936, she published the novel The Wheel Spins, and this became the basis for Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes, which in turn became one of the most successful British films of its time. In 1942, she published a novel titled Her Heart in Her Throat, and this was adapted into a thriller called The Unseen, released in 1945, and which is often seen as a follow-up to the movie The Uninvited, which we covered back in episode 18. Sadly, though, although Ethel did attend a special screening of The Lady Vanishes in her hometown, she did not live to see the release of her other two films, and she died on August 13th, 1944, in London. She left all of her worldly goods to her youngest sister, but this was on condition that her sister carried out some rather dark instructions. Quote, "I give and bequeath unto Andorra White all that I possess, on condition that she pays a qualified surgeon to plunge a knife into my heart after death." End quote. This certainly suggests that she had a pathological fear of being buried alive, and the request also featured as a plot device in one of her novels, titled The First Time He Died, which was published in 1935. But these wishes were indeed carried out, and following her cremation, her ashes were scattered in the Garden of Remembrance at Mortlake Crematorium in London. And now we are getting into the spoilers, including revealing the identity of the killer in the film, so please tread carefully from here on in. The novel Some Must Watch was initially recommended for film adaptation in 1941 by an employee at RKO Studios. They saw it as the perfect vehicle for Alfred Hitchcock, who they thought, quote, would get the proper atmosphere and terror with which the book is full, end quote. But it wasn't until 4 years later, in 1945, that producer David O. Selznick bought the film rights for his independent company Vanguard Films, who had a co-production deal with RKO Studios. On purchasing the film rights, Selznick brought Robert Siodmak on as director, and he also hired a screenwriter called Mel Dinelli to adapt the novel for the screen. Dinelli was a playwright who had also written for the CBS radio drama Suspense, and this was to be his feature screenwriting debut, so he also received input from a far more established screenwriter called Dor Sherry. The two made some significant changes to the story, shifting its setting from the 1930s, on the borders between England and Wales, to Vermont at the turn of the 20th century. And they did this because they felt it added a more gothic atmosphere. While the screenplay initially bore the same title as Ethel's novel, it was later changed, initially at least, to The Silence of Helen McCord. The film focuses on a woman called Helen, who is a live-in companion for Mrs. Warren, an elderly bedridden widow who lives on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Warren lives with her stepson Albert, who is a professor, her son Stephen, who is something of a playboy, to say the least, and who has just returned home from the war, and the household staff. The staff include Albert's secretary, Blanche, Mr. and Mrs. Oates, the housekeeper and handyman, and Nurse Barker. And although the town seems like an idyllic community, it has recently been plagued by a string of murders, the victims all young women who had some form of disability. And this is all very unfortunate for Helen, who has been suffering from mutism following a family tragedy, and who is clearly the killer's next target. As the night progresses, Helen becomes increasingly isolated. Nurse Barker, who is sick of being abused by Mrs. Warren, quits her post. Mrs. Warren loses consciousness, and Mr. Oates is sent into town for medical supplies. Meanwhile, Mrs. Oates gets drunk on stolen brandy, and Dr. Parry, a character who we meet earlier in the proceedings, and who is rather smitten with Helen, offers to take her away from the house, but is called away on a medical emergency. The opening of the film sets the gothic tone, with an overhead shot of a woman nervously descending a spiral staircase as a storm rages outside. It was Siodmak's idea to use this shot under the opening titles, prompting writer Dinelli to rename the movie The Spiral Staircase. This sequence suggests a descent into darkness, and also indicates the psychological approach that the writer and director were taking. Writer Joseph Greco has highlighted that the staircase resembles a human eye, an image that we will see multiple times throughout the movie. He's also said that the house itself, quote, is a metaphor for the killer's deranged psyche, end quote. And this approach immediately sets it apart from the traditional old dark house thrillers like The Bat and The Cat and the Canary, both of which we discussed back in episode 12. Part of the psychology of the film is the nature of voyeurism, something that is introduced in the opening moments post-credits. We see two small boys peering through a curtain into a Nickelodeon theatre, based in the lower room of a local hotel. The boys are then pushed aside by a hotel employee who, instead of going about his business, peeks through the curtain himself. At this point, the camera tilts up, and we see a sign above the theatre door, bearing the legend, "Motion Pictures, the Wonder of the Age." The camera then shifts to inside the theatre, and we see an audience of mostly women watching a silent movie on the screen. This introduction serves to remind us that we too are watching a movie. In fact, at this point, we are watching a movie of people watching a movie, a nice moment of meta-commentary before the action itself begins. This theme of voyeurism is built even further as we now move to a room where the first victim is getting changed. Unknowingly, she is being watched by a killer hiding in her wardrobe. The viewer is first alerted to his presence by the gentle movement of some of the hanging clothes, and then, in a very famous shot, the camera zooms in on the killer's eyes staring from the darkness, framed expertly by cinematographer Nicholas Musuraca. And we've mentioned Musuraca several times before now, mostly in connection with his work for Val Lewton, also at RKO Studios. This is an extremely powerful and disturbing moment. It initially recalls the spiral staircase seen under the credits, but it also confirms that all of our childhood fears about the boogeyman in the closet may well have been correct all along. As the theremin-based score from composer Roy Webb swells ominously in the background, the camera zooms directly into the killer's iris, and we see his perspective in the first of several subjective camera angles used throughout the movie. Siodmak chose to shoot this with a fisheye lens to represent the killer's distorted view of the world, and this moment is followed by a shot of the girl's hands as she is attacked at her most vulnerable, her dress caught over her head and unable to see or indeed fight back. This is a sequence that has quite rightly prompted much analysis, not least its influence on countless films that followed. Luigi Cozzi, the co-writer on many Dario Argento movies, has gone on record as saying that the close-up of the killer's eye was directly homaged in the director's second feature, Cat o' Nine Tails, released in 1971. It's also quite apparent that it's referenced in Argento's 1975 movie Deep Red, and also in the murder of Tilda in his film Tenebrae, which was released in 1982. But you can also see the DNA of this sequence in Bob Clark's 1971 proto-slasher Black Christmas, where the psychotic killer Billy hides in the wardrobe to murder his first victim, Claire. And, incidentally, to ensure that the close-ups of the killer's eyes did not give the game away, for these moments in the spiral staircase, Robert Siodmak himself stood in as the murderer, so it's his eyes that we see in the closet and watching Helen in the mirror later on. This alone would place the spiral staircase as a direct forerunner of the Italian giallo, but there is still more to come. After the murder is discovered, Helen is offered a ride home by Dr. Parry, and after being dropped off, she walks back to the Warren house just as a storm is starting to begin. She is followed through the trees by a figure whose identity is obscured by a hat and a dark raincoat, an image that immediately calls to mind the first murder in Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, that we will, of course, be discussing shortly. The way that this scene is shot is very far removed from the outline provided by the shooting script, which called for a medium shot of Helen going around a tree and dashing up the steps. Instead, Siodmak opted for a mosaic of multiple angles and a high crane shot as Helen runs through the garden, demonstrating a mastery that would earn him an Oscar nomination in the same year for his noir thriller, The Killers. There is a further anticipation of the giallo later in the movie when Blanche is murdered in the basement. We see the killer is wearing black leather gloves, which again is a staple of the giallo and also a very modern touch for the film, considering its period setting. Shot in a heavily stylized manner that to me also recalls Mario Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much, Blanche is mainly filmed in shadow, with only her outstretched arms visible as she meets her demise. And I have to say that one cannot help but feel very sorry for Blanche, whose only crime really is that she is attractive. In addition to being the object of Albert's obsessive love, she is also treated quite abominably by Stephen, who minimizes her discomfort and accuses her of being melodramatic. "I like to see women cry," he says. "Men like to see women cry. It makes them feel superior." No wonder then that she tells him that she doesn't like his attitude and that she plans to leave the house with Helen and Dr. Parry. Stephen's reaction to her is of course a red herring, but it also points to the psychological subtext of the film, demonstrating that the two sons have been deeply damaged by their domineering father, with one now a narcissist and the other a total psychopath. It's a pity, then, that this approach was rather sniffily dismissed by critics of the time. The New York Times wrote, quote, "This is a shocker, plain and simple, and whatever pretensions it has to psychological drama must be considered merely as a concession to current popular fancy." End quote. At least Pauline Kael was more favourable, writing in her review that she found the psychopaths to be quite presentable people, and that this, plus the skillful, swift direction, made the terror all the more convincing. The theme of voyeurism continues throughout the film. Mrs. Warren accuses the nurse of spying on her, Albert watches Stephen kissing Blanche, and Helen watches an argument between the two stepbrothers as she is clearing the table. Sensibly, though, Siodmak chose to refrain from pushing this theme too far over the edge, and decided to remove a shot that was present in the final script. This was yet another zoom in on Albert's eye as he closes in on Helen in the final act, and I have to say I agree with the decision, as it probably would have been a case of too much of a good thing had it been included. Although there are only 2 killings in the film, they are both highly stylized, but there are other impressively styled moments too. These include a sinuous low-angle dolly shot that reveals the killer's presence in the house as he watches Helen watching her own reflection in the mirror, highlighting the themes of voyeurism and the notion of looking once again. This is immediately followed by the second close-up of the killer's eye and also his fish-eye lens perspective. This shot reveals Helen's mouth, reflected as a blur, an image that borders on surrealism, with her reflection slowly sliding down the close-up of the killer's iris. There are also many nods to Siodmak's background in German Expressionism. The interior of the house is a maze of corridors, stairwells, and long dark shadows. While writer Joseph Greco believes the interiors to be a representation of Albert's insanity, my personal view is that they are a testament to family trauma and the legacy of the quite clearly malignant father. The rooms are cluttered with items from the past, including his portrait which looms over the fire in Mrs. Warren's bedroom, and this to me suggests that the inhabitants are trapped by a paternal figure whose very presence is everywhere, and indeed their own upbringing. "You know," says Stephen, "I'm inclined to think that father was disappointed in both of us. Neither of us fitted his concept of what a real man should be, a gun-toting, hard-drinking, tough-living, God-fearing citizen." He always used to say, "The strong survive, the weak die." But how wrong he was, Albert, because you and I, the meek, have inherited the earth. Producer David O. Selznick originally saw the film as a vehicle for Ingrid Bergman, but she felt the central character was not right for her and passed on the offer, at which point the role of Helen was offered to Dorothy Maguire. Maguire had begun her professional career as a model before acting on radio and also in an experimental TV broadcast titled The Mysterious Mummy Case, which was screened in 1938. Moving into theatre, she gained attention on Broadway and was then cast in the title role in the domestic stage comedy Claudia, in which she appeared for over 700 performances between 1941 and 1943. This caught the attention of Selznick, who brought her to Hollywood for her first screen role, which was the film adaptation of Claudia in 1943. She then appeared in two more features, the romantic drama, The Enchanted Cottage, and the drama, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, both in 1945. The Spiral Staircase would be her fourth feature film, and she gives a very good performance, particularly given that, apart from the final moments of the movie, she has no dialogue whatsoever. Her panicked running through the house at the climax and her frustration at her own disability as she tries to call for help are beautifully realised, as are the moments when she finally realises that Albert is the murderer. Maguire is joined by Ethel Barrymore, the sisters of actors John and Lionel, and also the great-aunt to Drew Barrymore, who probably needs no introduction. Beginning her career in 1895, she worked on stage, radio, film and TV, and her role in The Spiral Staircase would lead to an Oscar nomination. There have been those who have suggested that her performance tends to push a little bit into melodrama, but I would disagree. In my opinion, her performance is that of a woman who knows exactly what is going on in her own home, and being bedridden is powerless to stop it. Initially, at least. George Brent, who plays the major villain of the piece, Albert, also had a lengthy career, beginning on stage in the 1920s before appearing in films from 1930 onwards. Perhaps best known for his roles opposite Bette Davis in the films Jezebel and Dark Victory, here he gives a suitably menacing performance, even if, in my opinion at least, his identity as the killer is pretty much telegraphed from very early on. This is despite the numerous red herrings laid by the screenplay, which suggest that Stephen may be the killer, or indeed it may be Mr. Oates, who arrives in a similar outfit to the figure that we saw in the gardens. Early on in the film, the constable, played by James Bell, who we last saw in The Leopard Man, suggests that the killer could be anybody at all, creating a sense of small-town paranoia with his lines, "It could be somebody we see every day, might be me, might be you." Albert's motivation again speaks to the film's psychological approach, though it's doubtful that one could comfortably get away with the concept today. His father's perspectives have fed into his psychopathy, and he is now targeting those that he perceives as falling short of his parental vision. Quote, "There's no room in the world for imperfection. Stephen is weak as I once was. What a pity my father didn't live to see me become strong, to see me dispose of the weak and imperfect of the world, whom he detested. He would have admired me for what I'm going to do." Despite my praise for the film's opening, the killing of Blanche, and the very well-handled climax, it is fair to say that the film does drag ever so slightly in its middle section, with a rather poorly conceived dream sequence and the rather cartoonish performance of Elsa Lanchester as Mrs. Oates, both of which, in my view, kill the atmosphere somewhat. That being said, Lanchester does contribute to another beautifully realised scene, in which she descends into the wine cellar with Albert to steal a bottle of brandy. It's a gorgeously lit moment, once again proving Nicholas Musuraca's expertise with shadow and chiaroscuro lighting. Another rather irksome character for me is Dr. Parry, but this might be simply because, when watching Kent Smith, I'm unable to shake the image of Cat People's Oliver from my mind. And while he is a slightly more tolerable character here, his medical expertise is questionable at best. First off, he misinterprets Mrs. Warren's concern for Helen as a sign of dementia and also of a possible capacity for violence. Then he decides that the best way to treat Helen's PTSD is by telling her own story back to her. Quote, "She told me a story about a girl who was on her way home from school one day. She had good news for her parents. When she wasn't far from her home, she heard a fire engine rushing down the street. She started to run. When she turned the corner, she saw it. It was her house that was in flames. There was a crowd outside. She wanted to scream herself, but somehow she couldn't. She tried rushing into the house, but was held back because it was hopeless. So without being able to do one thing to help, she saw her mother and father burn to death." End quote. Now, naturally, this is all exposition for the sake of the story, and medical practice has, of course, changed since 1946. But even so, I'm not sure that thrusting someone's trauma in their face is the best way to cure somebody with PTSD. If that wasn't bad enough, he then decides to make the situation all about himself, saying, quote, "I don't like being an outsider, and you shouldn't either. I know what I'm talking about, because I'm an outsider here myself. A lot of people don't want me. They want me to quit, but I won't, because there's at least one person who wants me here, and that's good enough for me. And there's one person who wants you to talk, and that ought to be good enough for you. Look at me, look at me. Remember how wonderful it was when you had a voice, when you could say hello or thank you, when you could yell back at someone who started picking at you. I do it all the time. You look at me as though you don't believe it, but I know I'm right. Talk. Try it, try it, try it." End quote. That being said, though, I have to admit that Smith is marginally more likeable here than he is in either of the Cat People movies, but then again, the bar is set pretty low. On its release in 1946, The Spiral Staircase was a huge success, netting a profit of $900,000, which would be the equivalent of just over $1.5 million today. Critics were generally favourable, though, as we mentioned, some were not particularly impressed by the psychology behind the killer's motivations. Regardless of the critical response, the film has since gone on to be regarded as a classic, and, as I mentioned, it's also become highly influential. And while it may drag a little in its middle section, there is still a huge amount here to enjoy. And there's certainly far more to enjoy here than there is in the rather insipid remakes, which include a TV adaptation starring Elizabeth Montgomery and a 1975 version that starred Jacqueline Bisset, John Philip Law, Gail Honeycutt, and Christopher Plummer. Despite the best efforts of the all-star cast, I have to say I didn't particularly enjoy this remake, and if nothing else, it proves that much of the charm and style of the original was down to Siodmak and Musaraka more than it was the actual story. And that's not just my opinion. One reviewer called it, quote, "a modernised remake of the 1945 version using virtually the same script and apparently determined to prove how badly it could be presented." End quote. This was followed 25 years later by another TV version starring former Desperate Housewives actress Nicolette Sheridan and former member of The Breakfast Club, Judd Nelson. I haven't seen this, and to be honest, I don't have any intention to, but I can only imagine that it doesn't hold a candle to the original. Following the release of The Spiral Staircase, Robert Siodmak continued with film noir, with The Killers, also released in 1946, earning him an Oscar nomination for Best Director. This film introduced Burt Lancaster to the big screen and tells the story of a boxer who falls into a life of crime. Based on a story by Ernest Hemingway and featuring that staple of film noir, an insurance investigator, the film is told in multiple flashbacks and demonstrates the director at the height of his powers. This is particularly true of the tense opening sequence, featuring two contract killers menacing a small-town diner. Also starring Ava Gardner as that other staple of film noir, the femme fatale, it's available to watch in full on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. 1946 was a very busy year for Siodmak, as it also saw the release of another film noir, The Dark Mirror, which starred Olivia de Havilland as identical twins, one of whom may be a psychopathic killer. Much like The Spiral Staircase and Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound, this led heavily into Hollywood's interest in psychoanalysis and abnormal psychology. Olivia de Havilland, who plays the double role of twins Terry and Ruth, had taken an interest in method acting and insisted that the cast meet with a psychiatrist to bring psychological realism to the characters. And this is something that she would take even further just a few years later, spending months observing patients in mental institutions for her 1948 Oscar-nominated role in the film The Snake Pit. Whether her efforts on The Dark Mirror made any difference at all, I can't really say, but she does give two very good performances in a very enjoyable movie, and once again, you can find it in full on YouTube. Siodmak continued to direct further film noir, including Time Out of Mind in 1947, Cry of the City in 1948, Crisscross in 1949, which reunited him with Burt Lancaster, and The Great Sinner, also in 1949. Though sadly, none of these were a major success, and they also suffered from mixed reviews. By the turn of the decade, noir had reached the end of its heyday, and after one more attempt with Deported in 1950, he moved away from the genre, saying that he wanted to make films of, quote, a different type and background. In 1951, he released the drama The Whistle at Eaton Falls, and the Technicolor comedy adventure The Crimson Pirate, which again starred Burt Lancaster, who also acted as co-producer. This film also featured the Hungarian-British actress Eva Bartok, who we will see once again in our second movie of the week, Blood and Black Lace. But the production was not a happy one for the director, and shortly after he returned to Europe, bored of the films that he had been making for nearly a decade. Before he left the States, however, he began working on a screenplay with the working title A Stone on the River Hudson. This, as it would turn out, became a very early draft of the 1954 classic On the Waterfront. As a result, in 1954, Siodmak sued producer Sam Spiegel for copyright infringement, and although he was awarded $100,000 in damages, he received no screen credit in On the Waterfront, and his contribution to the original story was never officially acknowledged. More happily, in 1954, Siodmak was nominated for the Grand Prize at the Cannes Film Festival for his movie Flesh and the Woman, a French-Italian drama starring Gina Lollobrigida. And then, a year later, in 1955, he returned to Germany, where he made the film The Rats, which won the Golden Bear at the 1955 Berlin Film Festival. In 1957, he directed the German film The Devil Strikes at Night, and this was based on the true story of Bruno Ludke, a supposed serial killer who was accused of murdering 51 people over a 15-year period between 1928 and 1943. Arrested in Germany and executed without trial under the Nazi regime, it is now widely believed that he was innocent of the supposed atrocities. A former chief of the Dutch police reinvestigated the crimes many years later and found the evidence inconclusive, incoherent, and vague, and also expressed disbelief that a semi-literate man, who once got caught stealing a chicken, could have managed to evade authorities for nearly 20 years. It was also proven that, logistically, he could not have committed many of the crimes across Germany, and today many historians believe him to have been the victim of a frame-up carried out by an ambitious detective and a Nazi government looking for a scapegoat. Nevertheless, the film won the German Film Award for Best Fiction Film in 1957 and also received an Oscar nomination for Best Foreign Language Film. Siodmak continued to make films in Europe until 1967, though these are generally perceived to be of deteriorating quality. And then he returned to Hollywood screens with a western titled Custer of the West, which starred Robert Shaw and Robert Ryan. This was shot entirely in Spain, as was the vogue for westerns at the time, but it was met with a largely negative reaction from critics, and even today, currently holds a 25% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. His final production as director was a 6-hour, 2-part sword and sandal epic, The Last Roman, starring Lawrence Harvey, Orson Welles, and Honor Blackman. While it was praised by critics for its passion, splendor, and pathos, it was also criticized for not attempting to reflect history even remotely accurately. It's a rather sad epitaph for a director who contributed significantly to the noir genre and directed several films that are today quite rightly regarded as classics. Sadly, perhaps, he was just too good at film noir and subsequently found himself restricted by the association. He died of a heart attack on the 10th of March, 1973. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is Six Women for the Killer, or Blood and Black Lace, from Italian master director Mario Bava. This stars Cameron Mitchell, Eva Bartok, Ariana Gorini, and Thomas Reiner, and was released in 1964. Mario Bava is a name that I have mentioned many times over the course of the series so far, and I must admit it's probably rather negligent of me to leave discussing him in detail for so long. Possibly one of the most influential Italian directors of all time, his work has inspired people as varied as Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci, John Carpenter, Edgar Wright, Tim Burton, and Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino has said that a lot of the inspiration for Pulp Fiction came from Bava's 1963 movie Black Sabbath. Guillermo del Toro cited the director's camera style in interviews regarding his own movie Crimson Peak. James Wan stated that Bava's Planet of the Vampires was a direct inspiration on Aquaman 2, and the influence can also be clearly observed in Nicholas Winding Refn's movie The Neon Demon, Ridley Scott's Alien, and Friday the 13th Part 2, to name just a handful. Although he is most often associated with horror, Bava worked across a wide range of genre, including spy spoofs, crime dramas, sword and sandals epics, comic book adaptations, science fiction, biblical drama, and westerns. But for many, it is the Italian giallo for which he is best known. His 1963 movie, The Girl Who Knew Too Much, is the first giallo ever made, and pretty much set the thematic blueprint for the genre moving forward. While his second giallo, the film we are discussing today, defined the style with which the movement is best identified. When modern directors claim they are producing a film in the giallo style, such as Edgar Wright with Last Night in Soho, what they really mean is in the style of Blood and Black Lace, albeit often filtered through the later films of Dario Argento or Lucio Fulci. According to the website of the British Film Institute, quote, Bava took a vital role in the creation of the modern horror film. If there was to be a Mount Rushmore monument dedicated to 4 directors whose work pioneered a new form of big-screen chills and thrills, those giant faces etched in granite on the mountainside would be Mario Bava, Alfred Hitchcock, Georges Franju, and Michael Powell. End quote. Witty, self-effacing, and self-deprecating, Bava would doubtless have a few things to say about the multitude of praise his work has received since his death, particularly as he often referred to himself as simply a jobbing director. And whilst this attitude was no doubt informed by his treatment at the hands of Italian film critics, who often ignored or were derogatory about his work, this is also very much a statement of truth. Unlike the directors we have already mentioned, he was not really an auteur as such, with the ability to craft his own scripts or pick his own casts, or have total control over every aspect of production. One of the reasons that he made so many films across so many different genres was because these were the films that he was hired to do. And of the many films he directed, there were in fact only 2 where he was given his first choice of script, his first movie, The Mask of Satan, and a later film titled Lisa and the Devil. This does mean that sometimes the premise or the scripts are rather weak, and sometimes the actors are simply miscast. But while as a result it would be incorrect to say that all of his films are perfect, as Troy Howarth writes in his book on the director, quote, "They all have points of interest. Even his lesser films contain details and stylistic flourishes that set them apart from the films of his contemporaries," end quote. Going on to say that Bava's genius rested in his ability to make something out of nothing. Mario Bava was born in 1914 in San Remo, Italy, and was the son of one of Italy's pioneering cameramen and special effects artists, Eugenio Bava. When he moved into filmmaking, he inherited many of the tools used by his father to create visual effects, including optical glass elements that he would use throughout his career, and which gave many of his films a signature distorted and dreamlike effect. Coming from an affluent family, he was surrounded by the arts and developed a passion for painting, something that would certainly inform the strong visual elements in many of his films. He initially studied classics at university, but left before graduating, as he was not a fan of the gymnastics classes that were mandatory in Italian education of the time. His father's connections helped him into the film industry, where he initially designed animated title sequences for Italian versions of American movies, and he also assisted his father in the special effects department at Benito Mussolini's film factory, the Istituto Luce. In 1938, he married his wife, Iola, and became a cinematographer as a way of earning more money to support his expected family. His first screen credit as director of photography came in 1939 on a short directed by Roberto Rossellini, and he continued in this role for the next few years. After this, he moved into directing with a series of art documentaries. But his first real break in directing fiction, and a horror movie at that, came in 1956 on the set of I Vampiri, the first Italian horror movie of the sound era. This was being directed by Riccardo Freda, a name that will sound familiar to those of you who heard last week's episode about Spanish director Jorge Grau. Much as in that story, Freda left the production of I Vampiri early, on the penultimate day of shooting, and though this does sound as if he made it a habit, this is not the case. In this instance, he left either of his own volition, following a row with the producers, or, as Bava later said, because he was fired. In any case, Bava was left to pick up the pieces and finish the shoot. And while filming a shoot on the penultimate day might not sound like much, given that the entire shooting schedule was only 2 weeks, Bava had plenty of work to do, including changing several plot points and also adding in stock footage during the final edit. Much like Jorge Grau's Blood Ceremony, this movie was based on the legend of Erzibat Bathory, and while it was neither a financial or critical success, and Bava's contributions were uncredited, it at least gave him his first experience of directing a feature. After this, he was often called upon to provide uncredited directorial input into other movies. These include the first Italian science fiction film, The Day the Earth Exploded, in 1958, and the movie Hercules, also in 1958, and its follow-up, Hercules Unchained, in 1959. Both of these films, which starred the American bodybuilder Steve Reeves, were huge international successes, but Bava remained uncredited for his work, something that Riccardo Freda was very angry about, and which he recalled in a later interview, saying, quote, "Other directors used to call him, and Mario solved every sort of technical problem for them, always with a smile on his face. Then, he told me, at the film's theatrical premiere, they tried to hide him, giving him a seat in the back row, so that all of the praise would go to the director. He was disappointed by the way he was being treated, so I told him, either you quit working with these bad directors, or I won't call you again for my next film." End quote. And Bava did indeed work with Riccardo Freda again on his next feature, which, according to Troy Howarth, was designed by the more experienced filmmaker as a way of pushing Bava further into the director's chair. This was 1959's Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster, a science fiction horror partly inspired by Hammer's Quatermass experiment from 1955 and the American science fiction movie The Blob, which had been released in 1958. This tells the story of a group of archaeologists exploring an ancient Mayan temple who encounter an amorphous blob-like creature, and Bava was initially hired by Riccardo Freda as a cinematographer and also to create these special effects. However, Freda ultimately had other plans for him and deliberately left the filming early, leaving Bava to finish the project. A deliberate ploy to make Leonello Santi, the film's producer and the head of Galatea Studios, realise what a talented resource Bava really was. In the same year, he was asked to work as cinematographer and also to provide special effects for another Steve Reeves movie, The Giant of Marathon, which was being directed by Jacques Tourneur. Tourneur abandoned the project before any of the major action scenes were shot, and Bava once again finished the picture, bringing it in on time and within budget. Finally, producer Leonello Santi got the message and offered Bava the opportunity to direct his first feature, produced by Galatea Studios. This was 1960's The Mask of Satan, a period gothic which also introduced horror audiences to the legendary Barbara Steele. We're going to cover this movie in a later episode, so I won't say too much about it here, other than it is the story of an executed witch and her lover who rise from the grave to wreak revenge on the descendants of those who sent them to their deaths. Although it did not do well in Italy, it was a critical success in France and a huge financial success in the US, where it had been picked up by American International Pictures, redubbed, re-edited, and re-released as Black Sunday. Now widely regarded as a classic of Italian Gothic cinema, it made Barbara Steele a horror icon, even though the subsequent typecasting did cause her to later say that she never wanted to climb out of another fucking coffin ever again. Mario's son Lamberto, who was born in 1944, has recalled that after the international success of Black Sunday, producers began asking his father for more genre films. The next film offered to him was Hercules in the Haunted World, released in 1961. But before this, he served as a collaborator on American international co-productions, acting as a go-between with the Italian crew and the American directors. The first of these was Esther and the King in 1960, a big-budget religious drama starring Joan Collins, while the second, The Wonders of Aladdin, was a fantasy children's film. Hercules in the Haunted World, also known as Hercules vs. the Vampires, features the titular character travelling to Hades to retrieve a magical stone that will save his lover from a curse. Also starring Christopher Lee, it is possibly not the best of Bava's work, for the reasons previously mentioned, though it does contain some impressive imagery given the restrictions of both the story and the budget. He followed this with a 1961 Viking saga called Eric the Conqueror, which starred Cameron Mitchell, who would later go on to appear in Blood and Black Lace. This film, which is sometimes described as the best Viking movie ever shot in Italy, is a loose reworking of the 1958 American film The Vikings, which had starred Kirk Douglas. I have to admit that I've never seen it, though a review in the Monthly Film Bulletin at the time did say that the story was, quote, greatly enhanced by Mario Bava's filtered photography and fluid camera technique, and his effortlessly eclectic direction, end quote. And then, in 1962, he made the film that would change the face of Italian thrillers forever. This was The Girl Who Knew Too Much, also known as The Evil Eye, and it's widely regarded as the first Italian giallo. As I mentioned earlier, it also pretty much set the narrative template for the many films that would follow. The story tells of an American woman called Nora who travels to Rome and who is mugged and knocked unconscious one night near the Spanish Steps. When she wakes, heavily concussed, she witnesses a young woman being murdered and then faints again. Waking up in hospital the next morning, she reports the murder to the police, who can find no trace of a body or indeed any evidence at all that a murder has been committed. From here on in, Nora and her new friend Marcello must attempt to solve the mystery before the killer tracks her down to silence her forever. These elements, a foreigner abroad, a witness to a murder, and half-remembered details became the foundation for a significant number of gialli that followed, most notably Dario Argento's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage in 1970, which would take the template to more heavily stylized and violent heights. Despite its influence, Bava did not look back positively on the film, claiming that he thought it was, quote, too preposterous. Perhaps it could have worked with James Stewart and Kim Novak, whereas I had, I can't even remember their names. End quote. As I said earlier, rather self-deprecating. Regardless, the film is an incredibly stylish piece of black and white cinema with startling imagery, chiaroscuro lighting, and an attention to visual detail that would become the hallmark of many classic gialli, as well as Bava's own work. You can find it in full, although dubbed into English, on YouTube, and it goes without saying that I highly recommend it. In 1963, he directed The Three Faces of Fear, also known as Black Sabbath, an anthology movie hosted by and starring the great Boris Karloff. We mentioned it back in episode 8 when we discussed Karloff's career, and much like The Girl Who Knew Too Much, it comes highly recommended. The three stories are The Telephone, a giallo-styled short in which a sex worker is menaced by a series of phone calls, The Verdelak, in which Karloff plays a nobleman turned into a vampire, and most terrifying of the three, A Drop of Water, about a nurse who pays a frightening price for stealing a ring from the finger of a dead woman. The use of colour in this film, and the final story in particular, foreshadows the pop art hues that we see in Blood and Black Lace, and it is, in my opinion, one of the best anthology movies of the 1960s. And, as I mentioned in the Boris Karloff episode, if you are going to watch it, do try to track down the original Italian version rather than the US dub. It is, admittedly, rather disorientating watching Boris Karloff dubbed into Italian with English subtitles, but the American version changed the order of the stories and also made some significant cuts, so it's the original Italian film that you want to look out for. Having previously worked with Christopher Lee on Hercules in the Haunted World, the two paired up again in Bava's next film, 1963's The Whip and the Body, a movie that looked back to the gothic sensibilities of Black Sunday while incorporating elements of sexual sadism and masochism that were considered extremely shocking at the time. Writer Troy Howarth believes that The Whip and the Body is the director's finest film, and Christopher Lee felt it was one of the best European films that he ever made. While I wouldn't entirely agree with Howarth, I would certainly suggest tracking it down, though it may be worth bearing in mind that, for some reason, Lee didn't do his own dubbing in the English language version, and this was a decision that he later came to regret. And while the dubbing isn't nearly as awful as one might expect, much as with Boris Karloff, it is rather strange seeing Lee without his distinctive voice delivering the dialogue. The Whip and the Body tells the story of a sadistic nobleman who is murdered and who may have returned as a ghost. Dealing explicitly with themes of sadomasochism, in 1963 it was seized on charges of obscenity because of, quote, several sequences that referred to the degenerations and anomalies of sexual life, end quote. It was eventually released in Italy in January 1964 in a cut version, and was even more heavily censored in the UK, with all scenes of sadomasochism reduced to virtually nothing, which rendered the film practically incomprehensible as a result. It was initially released uncut in the US, though under the rather baffling title, What? And no, I've got no idea why that title was chosen either. Like many of the films we've discussed in this episode, there are multiple versions available on YouTube, but as I haven't watched any of these uploads myself, I can't tell you whether they are as the director intended, so do bear that in mind if you're going to track them down. Despite the view of Troy Howarth, Christopher Lee, and many retrospective critics, reviews of the time were fairly harsh, though given the extent of the censorship, it's no wonder that the English publication, Monthly Film Bulletin, did indeed call the film incomprehensible. Nevertheless, it certainly introduced a sadistic edge that would be even more clearly on display in his next film, and the second of this week's movies, 6 Women for the Killer, released in the US as Blood and Black Lace. And now we are getting into the spoilers, including the identity of the masked murderer. So, as always, if you haven't seen the movie and don't want things ruined, you might want to hit the pause button. That being said though, if we are completely honest, plot-wise there isn't a huge amount to this movie, nor is there particularly much in the way of characterization, subtext, or psychological depth. What there is, however, is an enormous amount of style and visual panache, and I think it's fair to say that it is this, rather than anything else, which carries the film. Set in contemporary Rome, though quite honestly, it could be set anywhere, the narrative is structured around the murder of 5 models employed at a fashion house owned by Countess Christiana, played by Eva Bartok, whose husband died some years earlier. The first victim, Isabella, is killed in the grounds of the building one evening on her way to a show, and her body is subsequently found posed inside one of the wardrobes. Soon after, her diary is found and taken by another model, Nicole, who in doing so signs her own death warrant. Shortly afterwards, another model called Peggy, who has also come into possession of the diary, is tortured and killed, all by the same menacing figure, a man in a black trench coat and hat, with a white stocking mask pulled over his face to completely obscure his identity. The police arrest all of the men connected with the fashion house, including the manager, Massimo, who is played by Cameron Mitchell. But while they are in custody, another model is killed. This time it is Greta, who, on returning home from work, finds Peggy's body in the trunk of her car, and shortly afterwards is smothered to death in her apartment. The police are forced to release all of the suspects, at which point the viewer, but crucially not the detectives, is given the identity of the killer. It is Massimo, who has of course been in custody all night, meaning that there are in fact 2 people committing the murders. The second killer is revealed to be Christiana, who murdered Greta to provide her lover with an alibi. It transpires that Christiana and Massimo murdered the former's husband for his money and have been secretly married, something discovered by the first victim, Isabella, who was trying her hand at blackmail. Massimo insists that the police will not rest until they find the killer, and another model, Tao Li, is killed by Christiana, who stages the murder to look like a suicide in an attempt to shift the blame onto her. But, as it turns out, Massimo has double-crossed Christiana and arranges an accident that will kill her while making her appear guilty of all of the murders. Christiana survives and shoots Massimo, but dies of her injuries in the final reel, becoming the 6th and final victim. In his excellent analysis of the movie, writer Roberto Curti describes the cultural phenomena that gave birth to such a lurid plot. These include, of course, the yellow mystery novels published by the publisher Mondadori, from which the subgenre gained its name. But he also describes a series of what he calls cheap pulp paperback novels, photo novels and comics with horror, mystery and crime-related content. These publications, he says, were sold not in bookshops but on newsstands and were filled with cheap hybrids that mixed blood, mystery, crime, and most of all, eroticism. These included photoromanzi, or photo novels, which were structured in the same way as comic books, but composed of stills that featured actors instead of illustrations. By the early 1960s, these had branched out from the original romance stories they once depicted into pocket-sized adult comics, portraying horror and, importantly, the sado-erotic. And it is quite clear that these stories, far more than the ones published by Mondadori, were the inspiration for the movie's admittedly paper-thin plot. The screenplay began life as L'Atelier della Morte, or the Fashion House of Death, and it was credited to Marcello Fondato and Giuseppe Barilla, although Fondato would be displayed as the main credited writer on the finished film. It was purchased by a studio called Emepi Cinematografica, a relatively small and new production company that had previously invested 30% into Bava's earlier film Black Sabbath. Here, however, they were going to be a major backer. By this time, Galatea Film, the production house that had given Bava his first break, was bankrupt, and Bava had been, cinematically at least, pretty much homeless as a result, attempting to strike deals with various production companies, none of which had come to fruition. Considered a highly profitable film director abroad, if not in his homeland, Bava was brought onto the project and then contributed changes and made additions to the script. While he did make several amends and edits, which we will be discussing shortly, Bava was not responsible for the change in Italian title to 6 Women for the Killer. This was a move that was most likely made by the production company during post-production and was designed to emphasize the body count nature of the film. The title Blood and Black Lace was chosen for its American release when it was picked up by the US distributors, the Warner Brothers. Of the 3 titles, I have to say I prefer 6 Women for the Killer, which I think emphasizes Bava's reduction of plot and focus on spectacle. But for the rest of this episode, I will refer to the film as Blood and Black Lace. Firstly, because it's shorter, and also because I suspect that this is the name by which most people now recognize it. His first significant change was to the film's opening credits. In the screenplay, the models were supposed to walk down a catwalk as the cast was introduced, but Bava changed this to a series of posed, static shots of the female cast standing beside fashion mannequins, while the men stand next to what appear to be wicker dressmakers' dummies. And these are, of course, all lit with the vibrant purples, greens and reds that would become the defining colour scheme for the giallo genre. This change effectively compares the female victims with the mannequins and suggests that they are no more than showroom dummies. Through this lens, they are pretty much interchangeable figures who, instead of displaying clothing, are fodder for the masked murderer, mere props in the visual spectacle that unfolds throughout the rest of the film. That the men are depicted beside hollow and faceless dressmakers' dummies might simply be Bava creating a study in contrast, but it also gives the impression that they are less significant within the narrative and are ultimately completely hollow figures of little to no substance. Regardless of the interpretation, the mannequins are a recurring visual motif throughout the movie, creating an uncanny valley series of images that also display the director's wry sense of humour. The presence of the dummies throughout the film hint at the artificiality of the narrative and serve to remind the audience that it's only a movie, with several of them posed in ways that either echo or interact with the events on screen, or indeed foreshadow the murders that are to come. And much like the song and dance numbers in a Hollywood musical, it is the murders that are the most important element of the film. Staged as set pieces, strung together by a wafer-thin plot, they are shot in a heavily stylized manner that acts as a deliberate contrast to the police investigation, the scenes of which seem incredibly banal by comparison. And much like a musical, where one has to wait incredibly impatiently for the next big production number, in this film the viewer cannot wait for the next killing, if only to wallow not so much in the murder itself, but in the elaborate staging and cinematography. The first murder, that of blackmailer Isabella, sets the tone for the others to follow, both in terms of the mise en scène and the sexualized component. Isabella, dressed in a red vinyl raincoat, is making her way through the grounds of the fashion house, observed by the masked killer waiting in the trees. And this, of course, is a scene which, as mentioned earlier, recalls the stalking of Helen in the garden in our first movie. Making her way down a tree-lined footpath, a scene that is superbly backlit by Bava and Antonio Rinaldi, the lights are suddenly extinguished, forcing her to continue in darkness. Realizing that she is being followed, she begins to hurry her pace until the killer springs from the shadows, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her head against the trunk of a tree. Once dead, she is dragged away into the darkness, her skirt rising over her thighs to expose her undergarments, stockings, and suspenders. This sequence of suspense, brutal murder, and then sexualization of the body becomes the template for the other killings that follow, a clear reference to the eroticized violence of the photonovellas that act as the story's inspiration. Although this scene sticks very closely to the original plan in the screenplay, it was Bava's decision to include the depiction of the stockings and suspenders, though it's worth remembering that this was far more to do with creating an arresting image than any form of sexual predilection on the part of the director. Although he was heavily associated, of course, with films depicting murder and mayhem, he saw these sequences more as an aesthetic challenge, always considering how he could make the shot more interesting visually than anything else. This is very much evidenced by the second murder, that of Nicole killed in her boyfriend's antique-filled apartment. This scene is illuminated, supposedly, by the flashing neon sign of the nightclub next door, a detail which wasn't in the original script. The flashing green light and purple shadows were entirely Bava's invention, and he also quite thankfully discarded an idea from the screenplay that would have been somewhat ridiculous. In the original script, the suit of armour by the doorway somehow comes to life, and Bava instead opted to have it stand menacingly in the background, only animated by a shove from the killer. This, of course, is before he brutally murders Nicole with a sadistic spiked metal glove, once again disfiguring her face as he had done Isabella. And once again, as with Isabella, Nicole's body is posed for those who discover her, this time below the suit of armour, as if to simulate sex. This is possibly my favourite set piece of the movie, not only for the brilliant lighting design, but also the way that the killer appears and disappears as if through supernatural agency, and the quite brilliant imagery, including Nicole's distorted reflection in a mirror as she runs through the building. Facial disfigurement seems to be Massimo's modus operandi, which suggests a deep-seated hatred of women, in that it is not enough to extinguish their lives, he must also destroy their beauty as well. This method of murder, facial penetration, has been used by Bava before, in the opening scene of Mask of Satan, and the spiked glove also foreshadows a far more unpleasant killing in the opening of the later giallo Death Walks at Midnight, which was directed by Luciano Ercoli and released in 1972. It is perhaps no surprise then that over the years many people have accused the giallo genre of being misogynistic. Whilst I think it is quite hard to argue in defence of Ercoli's spiked glove murder scene, I do think that Bava's dreamlike cinematography and lighting pushes his murders out of the realm of reality and into something far more surreal. And I think this film is an example of the distinction between graphic realistic murder and what Samuel Arkoff, the distributor of Black Sunday, called unreal violence. It's there to surprise, it's there to shock, but it's never really meant to represent real life. In his book on Bava, Troy Howarth expands on the misogynist argument even further, pointing out that the male characters are presented even more unfavourably than the female ones, and this is certainly the case. One is a sadist, another a drug addict, and yet another pretends to be wealthy while leeching off his girlfriend Greta. Even the detective, he points out, is cold and condescending, and I would also add, he never manages to solve the case, and in fact inadvertently gives the killer an alibi. Yes, of course the women are murdered, but they are far more interesting figures than their male counterparts, who are about as dependable and solid as the wicker figures that they pose with in the opening credits. Massimo's sadism is even more evident in the next murder, that of Peggy, who is both beaten and tortured, though again in a very cinematic and stylized fashion, as opposed to the modern torture porn that was in vogue, thankfully briefly, in the early 2000s. First her hand and then her face are pressed against a red-hot stove, which again sticks fairly closely to the shooting script in content, if not in its execution. It is also interesting to compare the killings committed by Massimo and the ones by Christiana, which, though admittedly merciless, have little of the violence of the first 3 deaths. Greta is smothered with a cushion, and Tao Li is drowned in a bathtub. Perhaps the shifting nature of the killer's MO in the murder of Greta is an indication to the audience that it is not the same person committing the atrocity, long before we discover that there are in fact 2 murderers. Even then, though, we may still be uncertain, as the bodies of Greta and Peggy are, like the others, posed after death, this time in a pseudo-sapphic pairing that, oddly enough, anticipates the photographic work of Helmut Newton. By the final killing, that of Tao Li, the film has shifted away from the conventions of the giallo and has moved more into film noir, with the narrative of the double-crossing lovers more in line with movies like The Postman Always Rings Twice. Perhaps this is why Bava opted to film the killing of Tao Li mid-sequence, another deviation from the shooting script which took a longer route to get to the act itself. With the killers identified, perhaps the director felt that a prolonged introductory scene was superfluous. And it has to be said that his choice to jump cut to an underwater shot of Tao Li's face as she is held beneath the surface acts as both a sudden startling image and an avoidance of more of the same. Whilst I am sure that most of these activities sound absolutely horrific, despite the brutality of the murders, there is very little blood or gore on display, with the violence implied through camera angles and judicious cutting, rather than depicted explicitly. The only blood that we see in the movie is following the death of Tao Li, when Christiana cuts her wrist with a razor blade, again off camera, and a flower of bright red blood slowly emerges in the water. It has to be said that Blood and Black Lace is a film that is best watched rather than heard or read about, as what you are probably imagining in your mind, if you haven't seen the movie, is probably 10 times more horrific than anything that Bava puts on the screen. And of course, it pales in comparison with any of the far more brutal horrors that we have seen in more recent movies. And while the need to strip the victims to their underwear before their murders is yet another indication of the screenplay's pulpy origins, the posing of the corpses and even the facial disfigurement do make some kind of sense in the context of the plot. Massimo and Christiana are determined to convince the police that the crimes are the actions of a sex maniac, a distraction from the true motive, which is decidedly more pedestrian and focused on the acquisition of wealth and the removal of a blackmailer. And it would seem that their plan works, with the inspector and his sergeant deciding that the killer must be, quote, a homicidal sex maniac. Perhaps female beauty makes him lose his head and kill, end quote. And while it is admittedly a rather tenuous rationale for all of the mayhem, it is a rationale all the same. As well as the murders, there are other impressive visual elements, including the use of shadows against the windows, the previously mentioned use of mannequins, the looming shot of Nicole's handbag containing the secret diary, and a beautiful moment of Tao Li's reflection caught in a mirror. There is also an incredibly sinuous tracking shot through the atelier as Massimo breaks into Christiana's jewellery case once he thinks she has met her demise. And this effect was achieved, according to lead actor Cameron Mitchell, by the director sitting on a child's trolley and being pulled through the studio. Unlike the spiral staircase, this is the only subjective shot in the film, though it remains remarkably unclear whose viewpoint we are supposed to be seeing. The narrative would suggest that it is Christiana, returning to the fashion house after her brush with death, and creating a diversion for Massimo so that she can reclaim her jewels. Others, though, have suggested that this is unlikely, and with Christiana being severely injured, it does seem a fairly circuitous route for her to return to the building, push over a dummy to create a diversion, sneak back into her office, and then hide in the secret passage behind the bookcase. So certainly we are seeing through the eyes of someone, but the question remains, whose viewpoint is it? Some have suggested that this is a joke moment, and much like the mannequins, is there to remind the viewer that this is just pure cinema. Others believe, though, that this is purely the audience perspective, and that he has placed the viewer in the eyes of the voyeur, something which you could say he has done for the entire movie. If nothing else, despite its mystery trappings, this is a film that is less about thinking and more about looking. The most significant change that Bava made to the script was in cutting much of the dialogue, not only between the two killers, but also between other characters, reducing the motivations to a bare minimum and essentially making the film pure spectacle. In the Aurum Film Encyclopedia of Horror, writer Phil Hardy argues that by stripping away conventional plot, Bava has created a film where, quote, the audience is no longer asked to care about who gets killed. The title announces and summarizes the action. The killer, in his featureless mask, is mainly the faceless representative of the male spectator, as he stalks, one after the other, a series of women guilty of nothing less than provoking desire. End quote. He then goes on to say, quote, here, Bava dispenses with hypocrisy. The killer's face is reduced to a blank screen, offering no comforting resistance for projective identification by male spectators, and representing a menacing everyman for female viewers. It is a genuinely disturbing movie, but it is also a demonic ceremony, visualizing the pathological dimensions inherent in the cinematic spectacle itself, confronting us with a pseudo-voyeuristic delirium that simultaneously fascinates and repels. End quote. Personally, I think this might be taking things just a little bit too far, and the removal of much of the killer's motivations is more to do with the fact that Bava was less interested in plot mechanics than he was in visual experience. And also, being blunt, he probably realised that most of the dialogue he was cutting was pretty lousy, which, given the extracts in Roberto Curti's book, I would say it most certainly was. If, like all of the mannequins, the mysterious tracking shot through the fashion house is indeed a joke played by the director and a nod to the cinematic nature of the movie, then he has one more last morsel of wit up his sleeve for the final shot. While the film opens properly with the swinging sign of the fashion house, which is in the original screenplay, it ends with a swinging receiver of a bright red telephone, which most certainly was not. This shot, of course, is a cyclical reference back to the beginning of the film, but in my opinion, it also acts, potentially at least, as a comment on Italian cinema of the time. We discussed in previous episodes the phenomena of the Telefoni Bianchi films that were popular under the rule of Benito Mussolini, a series of highly stylish and ultimately shallow movies in which the use of a white telephone represented the height of pure sophistication. The fact that Blood and Black Lace ends not with a white telephone, but a swinging bright red one, suggests that the days of the telefoni bianchi are long gone, and given the plethora of violent Italian thrillers and gory horrors that were soon to follow, I like to believe that this final shot was apt prophecy. On its release in Italy, Blood and Black Lace, like many of the director's films, was largely ignored by the critics, but those who did pay attention were actually rather positive. The daily newspaper, La Stampa, highlighted the fact that the script was clunky, no argument here, but also commented favourably on the photography and the director's quote-unquote excellent technique. The publication Lanita said that the director, quote, has lots of fun playing with macabre elements, ornaments, intermittent lighting, and changing colours, putting the characters to death in the most hideous ways. We cannot deny that, as a butcher, he has a pulse, end quote. Elsewhere, however, comments were not so positive. The Monthly Film Bulletin said, quote, if this is a very good example of Bava's work, it is a less good example of the murder thriller genre, being derivative, for the most part poorly acted and written, and risible, end quote. While Variety summarised the film as an okay mystery with a few chills here and there. Nothing like being damned by fake praise. Retrospectively, of course, it goes without saying that the film is now regarded not only as a fine example of Bava's work, but also as the film which influenced so many that were to follow. Yes, the plot is rather creaky, and the acting somewhat questionable at points, but in terms of visual originality and cinematography and style, it's incredibly hard to beat. People with bigger budgets and better technology may admittedly do it these days with far more glitz and polish, but Mario Bava was the first. Now, normally, at this point in the episode, I continue with a summary of the director's subsequent career, but we're going to be returning to Mario Bava on at least 3 more occasions over the course of the coming months, and I really don't want to give any spoilers, so this week, for a change, you'll just have to wait to hear what he did next. The Spiral Staircase and Blood and Black Lace are of course both linked by their raincoat-wearing killers, immense sense of style, and the significant influence on the horror and thriller genres. As I mentioned right at the top of the show, The Spiral Staircase is one of the earliest films to use a subjective camera as the killer's point of view, and I really don't need to tell you, all of the films we've seen employ this device since then. Its influence on the giallo genre, of which Blood and Black Lace is a prime example, is beyond dispute, and I'd like to think that this episode may have encouraged a few more fans of Italian horror to track it down. Blood and Black Lace was equally as influential, inspiring many directors in the subsequent years and helping to define a genre that would in turn go on to influence the American slasher film. And while following the success of Psycho, I have no doubt that the US masked killer movies would have emerged in any case. Without these 2 films before them, I wonder whether it would have emerged in the same shape, or indeed have been quite so successful. Then again, I guess that's something that we are never going to really know. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please remember, you can always email thehorrordouble@gmail.com and follow our Instagram account, thehorrordouble. Next week, we are discussing 2 films inspired by the works of English writer Daphne du Maurier. First up, we have Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds from 1963, starring Tippi Hedren, Rod Taylor, Jessica Tandy and Veronica Cartwright. Then we follow this with Don't Look Now from 1973 and director Nicholas Roeg, starring Donald Sutherland, Julie Christie and Hilary Mason. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com, And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. And until then, once again, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.